Okay, so one of the problems that I've noticed with this whole content creation, content production, self-improvement and productivity thing is that you actually end up consuming a much more content than you can actually ever even just process. And that's one of the biggest problems with me that I've realized over the past few weeks because I've been running and during my runs I listen to podcasts, and what happens is that over a period of a week or so I end up listening to 5 or 6 podcasts. I end up reading a few dozen articles or so, and every now and then I read a book. But over a period of time, if I really question myself whether I retain and process all the powerful insights that I get from all of these sources, I would probably answer no. And the reason is because simply this entire shtick of wanting to consume more as if some piece of content will change my life is really dependent on the idea of you consuming more rather than being able to process. So one fine day what happened was I was on my runs, and as usual I was listening to a podcast, and it just struck me that I should instead use the Pareto Principle over here for consuming content instead of really just going at it and consuming everything, being like a digital hoarder. And the Pareto Principle, for those of you who might not know, is the idea that 80% of the value in doing things comes from doing 20% of the things right. And really the idea is dependent on the fact that if you do 20% of the things very well, let's say if you have an exam coming up and if you really study 20% of the things very well, you're likely to get 80% of the marks in your exam. And that's really the entire idea. And obviously it can be interpreted both ways. It's just a heuristic at the end of the day. But the idea of Pareto Principle in consuming content is that with great content comes great responsibility. So the Pareto Principle for content consumption is this: spend 80% of your time processing content and only 20% of the time consuming it. Now, what do I really mean by that? I like to think of it as an insight generating framework. I know that Ali Abdal recently posted a video which is about the insight logging framework, which I highly recommend checking out. It's exactly the same process, or more or less the similar process that I use for consuming and sort of recording insights using Roam, Notion, Instapaper, Air, and a bunch of other apps that he talks about in the video. But as for the insight generating framework, I think it's composed of 3 basic steps. First one is content gluttony. Use only 20% of your time to consume as much content as you can. What that really means is that in a week, you set out, let's say 2 or 3 hours in which all your articles saved in Instapaper, or all the articles that you wanted to get to, or all the podcasts that you wanted to listen to, you just listen to all of them. You read all the articles in one go as if you're hoarding stuff. And you just set out like 2 hours in a week just to do that. And obviously you won't process or read or retain as much information as possible. But what will happen is that if you just set out only 20% of your time of the week to just do that, and 20% is obviously a heuristic, I'm just making these numbers up. If you set out 2 hours of your week to just consume as much content as you possibly can, what will happen is that you will retain the stuff that really resonates with you in those 2 or 3 hours. And by extension, you will spend 80% of your time outside of doing just that to, think about the stuff that you have retained. And that is where the second step comes in, which is the content digestion phase. In the content digestion phase, what you really want to do is you just want to process and think about the stuff that you've already consumed and just churn your mind, or write more notes on it, or develop every idea or concept that has struck you from the content gluttony phase. So what that means is that if I have listened to a podcast and some things just absolutely strike me, what I'm going to do in the content digestion phase is that throughout the week, after let's say I've listened to the podcast at 2x the speed in the content gluttony phase, what I'm going to do is throughout the week I will take notes on that podcast, or try to retain the stuff that I had actually learned, or try to revisit it and think about the ideas and the thoughts presented in that podcast so deeply that they're actually ingrained in my sort of being. And that is where the value of this framework comes in. I know that there is a trade-off between reading things quickly and processing them deeply. But really, the biggest constraint in just this entire content consumption thing is that you don't have enough time. You simply have 168 hours a week. You have work to do, you have learning to do, and you have chores to do, and a lot of other stuff that you also have during the week. So this 80-20 rule for content consumption allows me to process the stuff more rather than take in more content and not actually be able to process it. And that is where the value of this really comes, for me at least. And the third step in this Pareto principle for content consumption is that whatever else you come across during a week relating to some good article, podcast, book recommendation, idea, or thought, you just want to log that down in your inbox. And how I exactly go about sort of doing this content consumption and applying this Pareto principle for my content consumption is through Roam, and that's exactly what I'm going to show you in this video. Okay, so this is what I have over here. I have some notes that I took today from a great conversation I had with a new friend of mine, Linus, over here. But really, to get down to the content creation and consumption phase, what I want to do is I want to show you notes that I took for a particular podcast by Venkatesh Rao, who's an independent consultant and has consulted many folks in the business sphere. And although it's not as fully fleshed out and as comprehensive as I would like it to be, there are still plenty of notes that I took from a podcast of Venkatesh Rao with Shane Parrish, which is essentially fantastic. And I highly recommend listening to it. It's a bit dated, but regardless, it has some fantastic ideas. And what I did for that podcast was that I listened to it in like 30 minutes or so, listening to it at like 1.5x the speed. And what I then did was during the week, I would try to retain the stuff that Venkatesh said in the podcast and just note it all down as much as I could recall from my memory. So let's go over here. So here are my evergreen notes, something that I've talked about in a bunch of my previous videos from that podcast. Basically, this is everything that came to mind during the week. A few things that struck out to me are the biggest crises happen over time, which is contrary to knowledge work should develop and grow over a period of time. So building a second brain is important. And these notes are not really meant for everyone's understanding. They're really for my own processing. But that's the entire value of this framework, that it creates so much value for you because you know the entire context of the podcast that you can literally write Greek or Latin and it just works for you because you and only you know what is the context of that podcast, and you and only you will be able to derive the maximum value if you sort of follow this 80-20 rule for content consumption and content processing. So yeah, I learned that it's always best to go for theory and practice at the same time. If you would first want to write out the theory and then do practice, you will never ever be able to reach to the practice stage. The concept is similar to why you should have one knowledge and project management area, because otherwise you will only focus on your projects and never your knowledge. So that's just something that related to the Venkatesh Rao podcast, which were thoughts of mine from a different area, but something that came to mind during the week. But the real notes of the podcast are over here, that there are three kinds of decision makers. People who make decisions based on affiliations or their recognition with a certain group of people known as the tribal decision makers. Then there are the decision makers who take decisions based on good and evil premises, whether something is inherently good or not. And finally, there are those people who take decisions based on mental models. And then he goes on to talk about mental models, why mental models are important for internal consistency more than external sense making of the world. And that is why it's important to have mental models. And mental models should be simple so that they are consistent, they are cohesive, and they do a great job at putting a set of blinders on your eyes, because there is just too much information out there and you only want to consume what you can retain. So really, I mean, all of the stuff that I've just said, I didn't write it down, I didn't practice it before, I just said it because this framework, this 80-20 rule for content consumption and content processing has just fit the insights of this podcast so deeply in my mind that I'm just going to retain it, carry it with me for a long time. And that is the entire value in this entire framework. And that is why I feel that what's really valuable in this whole content consumption and productivity shtick is that you should really know what your capacity is. If your capacity is to consume a bunch of information during the week and then also be able to process it? Sure, you should absolutely do it. But what's worked for me is to have a limit on the amount of stuff that I consume, because I end up falling victim to literally saving everything that I want to read later. Then what happens over a period of time is that my inbox fully just blows up and I'm never able to get down to all of the stuff that I really want to read. And Andy Matuszczyk, another guy who I've talked about in a bunch of my previous videos, says a lot that you should actually only trust an inbox if you know that you're going to drain it. So my Instapaper right now has about 280 or 300 unread articles. Yeah, I have in fact 449 unread articles. And right now I'm reading Mark Anderson on productivity, scheduling, reading habits, work, and more. But really, if you look at my Instapaper, I have a bunch of stuff that I've just not gotten the time to read or watch videos about. And that just makes the inbox unreliable. Which brings me to the second point, that really what you want to do is you want to have a reliable inbox in which you can store anything that you come across during the week. So let's say that in the 20% of the time that I've read one article or 5 articles, I have logged my insights in 80% of the time during the week. But during the week, I still come across 1 or 2 articles that I absolutely cannot resist reading. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Chrome. I have this shortcut called Inbox over here. I'm going to open my inbox, and everything that I find that I can just put down over here like a dump, I'm just going to do that. And that's exactly what I did on, let's say, these 2 things at least. I put down everything that I thought was something that I just absolutely had to note down, no matter the framework. And that's the third rule of the framework, that whatever you find absolutely irresistible, note it down, but note it down in the inbox so you know that it's in your mental inbox that you haven't really processed. And at some point of the day, at some point in the future, make an effort to clear up the inbox. And clearly, I haven't done a good job at clearing my inbox, but over a period of time, I will. And that's why I feel that this insight generating framework, this Pareto Principle for content consumption, is what I feel has really worked for me over the past few days. And that's why I think that everyone should use it more than just consuming content endlessly. So that was pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching this video, and let me know how you feel about it.